Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of We Are What We Read. This is a very special episode in that we have invited some of our crime fiction family from the UK. It was much easier to schedule all of them for one episode, so we'll probably do several episodes that are UK-based, but this is our first, and I'm very excited to welcome these guests. And once again, I have my co-host, Shawn Reilly Simmons, with me.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me again, Kristopher. It's always an honor to be doing anything with you. I appreciate being here.
Thank you so much, Shawn. And we're going to jump right into it because we have a great lineup. So we're going to go and we're going to start with Sarah Hilary. Sarah Hilary's debut, Someone Else's Skin, won Theakson's Crime Fic Novel of the Year 2015 and was a Silver Falchion and Macavity Award finalist. Her latest thriller, Blackthorn, is out now. Megan Abbott called it a mesmerizing story of family and community, secrets and lies, psychologically rich and captivatingly told. So very happy to welcome you to the episode, Sarah.
It's lovely to be here. Thank you so much for having me on the show. I think I can't be the only writer who finds it much more fun to talk about other people's books than my own. So I think this is a really great idea. And thank you so much for inviting me on. So I am going to talk about Your Blue-Eyed Boy by Helen Dunmore. Helen Dunmore wasn't a crime writer, but she did write two of the best psychological thrillers that I've ever read, Talking to the Dead and Your Blue-Eyed Boy, which is a book about blackmail, but not about blackmailers. Blackmail in this book slips through a door you left open or a window. It's insidious and dangerous, can destroy your life if you let it. I love this book from its opening lines, which I'm going to read now. There are things you should know about blackmail in case it comes tapping at your door. There's what it does to you, and there's what it makes you do. I used to think I knew what I could be made to do. How can you not read on? There's the setting, or rather settings, because the story takes place both in the past, over one glorious, beguiling, sexy summer by the sea in America, and in the present, on the fens in Norfolk, in a liminal space between land and sea, where the fog creeps in and the sky presses down, swallowing everything. Simone, who narrates the story, is in her 40s with two young sons and a husband who is suffering from depression. The family's trying to recover from bankruptcy, forced to live in an isolated, windswept house away from everywhere, while Simone works as a county court judge. Her job is the only thing standing between them and ruin. Into this precarious present slips the knife-like business of blackmail. The man she loved when she was 18, reminding her of that wild, reckless summer, threatening to dismantle her authority and control. Michael is a tremendous character, and Simone tells his story with such passion and compassion, but it's also a mixture of sort of lust and revulsion in a strange kind of way. The story of a young man and his friends who are plucked from their adolescence and sent to war. I'll very briefly read the tiny introduction to that she does. History hit you like a storm. You were lifted out of your lives, disgorged in belly loads by planes that lumbered in looking too heavy to fly. As soon as you put your foot into the soil, it stuck. You were history now. When these two people collide on an unforgiving, stony beach in a grey dawn, you know something monumental is about to happen, something that's going to alter their lives forever. And it does. Right up until that final page, Helen Dunmore weaves her spell to hold you to the story. You taste the fish that's cooked on the beach that summer long ago. You feel the sun on your limbs and later the wind whistling into your bones, the coldness of the mud and the water, the bleakness of the immense sky. You see a candle snuffing out at a drafty window, the one that was left open a crack, hardly at all, but enough for blackmail to slip in. I just loved how it made me feel all these conflicting emotions. So love and hunger and fear and lust and grief, and how slippery the worlds felt as the pages turned, how easily you could drop from a safe, comfortable existence into a desperate fight for survival. So that is my choice. Your Blue-Eyed Boy by Helen Dunmore. Read it. You won't regret it. I loved it.
Ooh, that sounds so good. I'm gonna have to read that one. I haven't read it. And I love the idea of blackmail. I've never thought about being a criminal, but if there was like a crime university that I had to go to, I'd probably major in blackmail. I could probably pull that one off. So that is intriguing. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. I really appreciate it. Yeah, thanks. And it's an honor to meet you. I'm a huge fan, obviously. Like I think everyone is, but it's nice to meet you.
Wonderful. It's wonderful to be here. Thank you so much. And to meet you and Chris at last as well. It's fantastic. Thank you.
Thank you. See you soon. Our next guest is my friend Martin Edwards. We're so happy he's here. Martin Edwards is the author of 22 crime novels, including the Lake District Mysteries and the Rachel Sabernick books. In 2020, he won the CWA's Diamond Dagger, and he has also received 2 Eggers from the MWA and Lifetime Achievement Awards for his fiction, nonfiction, short stories, and scholarship. He has been president of the Detection Club since 2015, and his books include A History of the Genre, The Life of Crime. Welcome, Martin.
Well, thanks very much indeed, Shawn. It's great to be with you and Chris and a number of other wonderful friends in this special UK edition. I'm going to take a completely different approach from Sarah's wonderful discussion of the book by Helen Dunmore. I'm going to talk about a non-fiction book, and it is not a recent book. It's an older book. It's this one, Bloody Murder. Or as it was known in the United States, Mortal Consequences. Perhaps Bloody Murder was too testing a title for an American readership of that time. But it's written by Julian Simmons. It's a non-fiction account of the history and the evolution of the crime and mystery genre. It was first published in 1972. This is the first edition. There were actually 3 editions, and I read each one with great enthusiasm because it was a book that made a great impression on me from the time I read the first edition in paperback form when I was about 20 years old. And at that time I was already a devotee of crime fiction, and I knew I wanted to write crime fiction, but I didn't know much about it. I was keen to find out more. Of course, in those days, we're talking about the late 1970s, there's no internet. It was much harder to get information. And this book, Bloody Murder, supplied me with a huge amount of information about the past writers as well as some of the then contemporary writers. And Julian was a remarkable guy. As I say, he was a novelist as well as a writer of nonfiction. He was a reviewer. He was a very opinionated guy, and he didn't disguise his opinions in his writing. And there was much in the book that I was fascinated by, and there was much that I disagreed with, but it's so beautifully written. He takes you along, and he makes his case very persuasively, even if you don't necessarily agree with what he says. So he was a great admirer, as I am, of authors like Dashiell Hammett and Raymond Chandler and Agatha Christie and Anthony Berkeley. He had many blind spots, though. So Dorothy L. Sayers, Cornell Woolrich, he couldn't be doing with them. And I do part company with him on a number of his views about some of the writers he particularly disliked, because he didn't mince his words. And I think he was rather harsh, and he was known with his reviews for being a pretty tough critic. And in fact, in the late 1950s, there was a move to expel him from the Crime Writers Association because he wasn't writing sympathetic enough reviews of some of his colleagues. So that was a motion that failed. But he was a controversialist. But the controversies are part of what makes the book so enjoyable. I learned a great deal There had been a previous history by the American writer Howard Haycraft called Murder for Pleasure, but really Bloody Murder was the definitive book of its time. And it went into further editions, and this is the final edition, the 1992 edition, and Julian inscribed it to me because I got to meet Julian shortly before he died. And to this day, he's the only person I've ever written a fan letter to because I admired Bloody Murder so much. I'd learned so much from it. The information was fascinating. Even the bits I didn't agree with, I was still fascinated by what he had to say. So I wrote him one of those letters which begins by telling him what a great book it is, and then says, "But what about this?" And in fact, he wrote me a very kind reply, and that's a letter I shall always treasure. I've never written another fan letter because I thought I could never top that one. But Bloody Murder is a book of its time. Of course, it's 30 years since the most recent edition was published, but it's still, for me, a touchstone. It's been a great influence on me, both as a reader and indeed as a novelist over the years. And I still think it's really fascinating to dip into it and find out more, not just about writers of the past, but of the views of a guy who thought that the detective story was dead and gone, and it had been replaced by the psychological suspense novel of the kind that Julian used to write himself so very well. Now, I think he was wrong about that. The current revival of Golden Age and cozy crime have probably got him turning in his grave, but I think he did mellow with age, and certainly when I met him, I found him to be a very pleasant chap indeed, as well as a terrific writer. So Bloody Murder is a book to savor and to read again and again.
Thank you so much, Martin. It's great to have a nonfiction book in the list. There's not too many. We've had a few, but not many, and then a professor to tell us about it is great. So thank you so much for bringing that to us.
Thank you.
And it's a great segue into our next guest, who is Jamie Bernthal-Hooker. Jamie Bernthal-Hooker is a visiting fellow at the University of Suffolk, UK. He is an Edgar-nominated author and editor of several books about Agatha Christie and regularly hosts conferences devoted to the golden age of crime fiction. So happy to welcome you, Jamie.
Hello, thank you so much for having me. And the title I've chosen actually follows on really nicely from Martin's last point about the movement from the Golden Age crime novel to the psychological thriller. I have chosen this absolute masterpiece. Oh, you can't see it because I've got a blurry screen, but it's Endless Night by Agatha Christie. This is an extraordinary novel. It was published in 1967, quite towards the end of Agatha Christie's life, and it's unlike anything else she ever wrote. At the same time, it is one of her most quietly beloved books. I've never met anyone who doesn't like it, and I've never met anyone who saw the twist coming at the end. Or I've never met anyone who I believed saw the twist coming at the end. It's really a book I've chosen because it's different. So you kindly mentioned that I've done a lot of academic work and research on Agatha Christie. And one of the things that's really got me moving in that research is this idea that we haven't been talking about Christie or the Golden Age crime writers in enough detail. We haven't been seeing all the great things they do. We've been thinking about them as people who could write good plots, good mysteries, and two-dimensional characters. But they were, especially Agatha Christie, was so much more skilled and talented and did so much more in their fiction than that. And I think Endless Night as a novel really shows that. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about the story. So it centers on the narrator, a 22-year-old working class man, so exactly like Agatha Christie, called Mike Rogers. And he one day sees and falls in love with an abandoned piece of land, which the locals say, oh, keep away from that, it's cursed, no good will come to you. So, of course, he marries a beautiful woman and who has money, and together they build a house on the cursed land. And then things start going wrong. They start getting omens, messages, threats, and eventually someone dies. And we follow what unfolds through Mike's eyes. It's a slow unfolding of psychological pressure as he comes to evaluate his relationship with his wife, Ellie, and with her family. He comes to question things about whether you can make your own identity, whether you are stuck with the class you're born into, whether you can have the things you want if you don't think you deserve them. And all the while, nets are closing in on the murderer. And it's not really a murder mystery, but it can be read as one. And when people talk about Endless Night, because it's not one of the best known books, people don't really know how to talk about it because it's not really what we expect from Agatha Christie. So people focus on the plot, the fact that it combines elements from two of her most famous books, which I won't tell you which ones because that will spoil it, but it does that. But it does it brilliantly in a way where you don't see it coming. It's so, if you think about some of Christie's biggest twists, Murder on the Orient Express, The Murder of Roger Ackroyd, they've been done to death by other writers and you can see them coming a mile off. She did two of her most famous twists in this book in a completely new way. And I think the way she did it was not to focus on plot, but on theme, and to draw those twists out for all the psychological implications they have. This was 1967. She was 77 years old, and people were saying she was past her best. But also, we were in that age that Julian Simmons was talking about, the age towards the psychological turn, and she was keeping bang up to date. In this book, which is both a gripping mystery and a thrilling character study, we see the depths of a writer's skill. We also see Christie doing what people like Patricia Highsmith were doing, what people like Ruth Rendell and Caroline Kepnes would do, and be heralded for rightly, with people talking about them creating new ways of writing crime fiction. Christie did it as well, and she did it brilliantly, and she did it while still keeping her Agatha Christie identity. So I love this book because it shows me there's more to crime fiction than perhaps we are talking about. It shows me that Christie is not just a cozy writer, and it shows me that we can read these books and find deep truths and just really, really exciting, thrilling stories, and everyone should read it. And I love it. And that's my little soapbox done for the day. Thank you.
Wow, you speak about it with such passion. I cannot wait to revisit it. That's going to be my gift to myself this holiday. When the seasons start to change and the holidays are coming up, I get in like a Agatha Christie mood. So I'm going to start with that one, and I'm going to think about you and the way you talked about it this year. Thank you so much for bringing that to us. That's the nice thing I can say about British fiction that I didn't say in the beginning. I was raised on Agatha Christie in the Golden Age. My mom was an English teacher, and she would just give me those books, and that's how we rolled in our house. So I'm so glad to have you all here today. Our next guest is Kate Charles. As you may be able to tell when she opens her mouth shortly, Kate Charles grew up in Ohio, right next door to Indiana. But don't let that put you off. She's been living in England for nearly 40 years and is thoroughly steeped in British culture, not least the Church of England, which provides the background for her two series of crime novels, the Book of Psalms series and the Callie Anderson books. Former chair of the Crime Writers Association, Kate has also served as chair of the Barbara Pym Society. Welcome, Kate.
Hi. My book, thank you very much for having me. The book that I'm going to talk about today is not a crime novel. It's called A Glass of Blessings by Barbara Pym. As a child in the US Midwest, I was a voracious reader and haunter of my local public library. My tastes leaned heavily towards English or British children's books, Peter Pan, The Wind in the Willows, Alice in Wonderland, and then later on books by Alan Garner and Tolkien and Lloyd Alexander and C.S. Lewis, and so on. And England was then and has continued to be the landscape of my imagination. As a teenager, I immersed myself in Agatha Christie, Dorothy Sayers, Josephine Tey, Marjorie Allingham, and I discovered P.D. James. So when, as a young adult, I encountered the novels of Barbara Pym, it was a case of love at first sight. Barbara Pym, in case you've never run across her books, was a mid-century English novelist who specialized in the sort of quiet domestic stories which today might be marketed as cozy women's fiction. They're closely observed, detailed, perceptive, and yes, very often very, very funny. She's frequently compared by her admirers to Jane Austen. She wrote the majority of her novels in the 1950s. They were critically well received and they sold very well. But as the 1960s arrived, critics and publishers, if not readers, embraced an edgier sort of fiction, and she suddenly found herself unpublishable for a number of years until, through a series of circumstances, in the late 1970s, she was rediscovered. Her later novels were understandably a bit darker, more mature, and before her death in 1980, she had the vindication of being shortlisted for the Booker Prize. And it was only then, after she'd been rediscovered, that her books were published in the US, and I discovered her. In the intervening years, I've read all of her books multiple times. They're my go-to comfort reads, even the more uncomfortable ones of her second phase. And though I adore Excellent Women and consider it one of the masterpieces of 20th century fiction, the one closest to my heart is A Glass of Blessings. Its plot, which takes place in the space of exactly 1 year, revolves around a woman called Wilmot Forsythe. And indeed, it is a first-person story told in her voice. Wilmot isn't actually very likable. She's self-absorbed, rather naive, and fancies herself an expert at managing other people's lives. In a way, she reminds me of Jane Austen's Emma. In her early 30s, Wilmot lives a life of privilege with a well-to-do, if boring, husband to support her and very little to occupy her time. Out of boredom, as much as anything else, she gets involved in her local church, where she encounters some interesting characters and amusing situations. She also becomes romantically distracted by Piers Longridge, the brother of her best friend. So why do I love this book so much? Well, I suppose the first reason has to do with the high church Anglican setting, which intrigued me greatly at first reading and has subsequently become the setting of so many of my own books. The second reason is Pym's treatment of homosexuality, which, it's important to remember, was actually illegal in Britain at the time the book was written. Throughout her novels, she includes gay characters and treats them not just with toleration or acceptance, but with genuine affection. This was a pretty brave thing to do in the 1950s in the UK. Those are my readerly reasons why I love this book. And there's one more writerly reason. I am in absolute awe of Barbara Pym's skill in making the reader know and understand more than Wilmot the narrator does. It's blindingly obvious to the reader, or at least it was to me, that Piers, the object of Wilmot's misplaced affection and hopes, is gay. But it comes as a huge shock to Wilmot at the end of the book. Every time I read this book, I ask myself, how did she do that? So I heartily recommend Barbara Pym's Glass of Blessings.
Thanks so much, Kate. I too am a Pym fan, and I do appreciate her efforts into as a gay man to bring awareness to the LGBTQ plus community. So thank you so much for bringing that book to us today.
You're welcome.
Our next guest is Sophie Hannah. Sophie Hannah is an internationally best-selling crime writer whose books have been published in 51 countries. The fifth in her series of new Hercule Poirot mysteries, Hercule Poirot's Silent Night, is published today. Congratulations, Sophie. And her murder mystery musical movie, The Mystery of Mr. E, will be streaming exclusively on Amazon on November the 25th. I cannot wait. Welcome, Sophie.
Thank you. Well, the book that I would like to talk about is by Agatha Christie, but she published it under a different name. She published it under the name Mary Westmacott, and it's called The Rose and the Yew Tree. And I, despite thinking I'd read everything that Agatha had ever written, I had not read any of the Mary Westmacotts by 2020. I just didn't think I would like them because I'd always assumed they were romances, and they were initially published as romances. And I would probably never have discovered The Rose and the Yew Tree if it wasn't for something bizarre that happened in my personal life, which I'm now going to tell everybody. So, September 2020, I received a poison pen letter from a close friend of mine. And I mean, that's a whole other story, but basically, this friend of mine was a psychotherapist, and she was in the process of trying to go off with romantically one of her patients, one of her clients, and steal him from his wife, who was also a close friend of mine. And because I didn't sort of say, yay, go for it, she sent me a poison pen letter. And so I was cross. I was very, very cross. I'm glad Jamie's looking suitably shocked because her behavior was just appalling. And so I went from being very close to her to being so shocked and thinking she was one of the worst people ever. And so I went online and searched for books about friendships that go wrong, or people who end up seriously disliking those who they've previously really liked. And I did all kinds of searches, couldn't find anything that sort of seemed to hit the spot. And then The Rose and the Yew Tree came up. I can't even remember what search term I put in, but it said, this is about someone who, a book about someone who hates a former friend. And I was like, right, this is the book for me. I have to read it. So I bought it and read it. And I was astonished, A, to find that it wasn't a romance, but B, to find that it is as gripping, suspenseful, addictive as all of Agatha's brilliant crime novels. I was absolutely riveted by this book. It is very mysterious. Like, you have to find out what happened in the past, what happens in the future. So anyone who thinks they love Agatha Christie's crime fiction, but thinks, well, Mary Westmacott books weren't crime, I promise you this is as gripping as any Agatha mystery. So the story starts when the narrator is visited by a woman he's never met before. She's traveled from across the world to see him. And she says to him, this man, John, she calls him Father John, I think. He's become some kind of exalted figure in her community. So she says, Father John is dying. He's on his deathbed, and his last wish is for you to come and see him. And at first the narrator says, I don't know anyone called Father John. And then he realizes that it's this chap called John Gabriel, who he used to know very well, and who is the person who he most loathes in the whole world for reasons that we, the reader, don't know. But the woman who comes to see him is so persuasive that he reluctantly agrees to go and visit this John fellow. And partly because he's so mystified by why this guy should want to see him after all these years, because, you know, he thought they were enemies and he thought the other guy thought they were enemies. And then we go back in time to the beginning of the story of how the narrator came to meet John in the first place. And then we see their sort of the people they had in common, and there's a woman involved, and there's a sort of political career involved because John was a politician, wanted to be a member of parliament. And so we gradually find out what happened, and it's absolutely gripping. But I also think that it might be one of the subtlest and cleverest books Agatha Christie ever wrote, because I think hidden within this book, which seems to be a sort of psychological drama, hidden within the book, I think there is a crime novel. And I don't want to say how or where the evidence can be found, but there is a way of reading this book in which it is a crime story. But the crime element is so subtly woven in that most people will never realize that it's a crime novel. And I can't really say any more than that without giving it away. But if anyone reads this book on my recommendation and doesn't know what I mean about the subtle hidden crime aspect, please do email me via my website and I will explain what I mean. But I'm not explaining it to anyone who hasn't read it. Anyway, it's an absolute masterpiece. I think it's as good as the very best of her Agatha Christie novels.
Wow, I'm going to read this next. I cannot wait. Cannot wait to read this. Yeah, I can apply it to some people too. So this is awesome. I cannot wait to read this. Thank you so much for that recommendation. I just love how you're all speaking with such passion on these titles. It blows me away every time we do this. It is so fun. I learned so much from you all. But thank you, Sophie.
Thank you.
Our next guest is Winnie M. Lee. I get to introduce the Americans. Winnie M. Lee is an author and activist, originally American, but she has lived abroad for years. Her debut novel, Dark Chapter, was nominated for an Edgar Award and translated into 10 languages. Her latest novel, Complicit, was a New York Times Editor's Choice and shortlisted for the Royal Society of Literature's Encore Award for Outstanding Second Novel. We're so excited to have Winnie here. Winnie, take it away.
Sure. Well, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be, one of the kind of adopted British people, American who's been living abroad for a while. My book is Cloud Atlas, which you may be familiar with the different cover. I've seen loads of different covers on this book. It's a quite well-known book. It's not a crime novel per se, but it does have sort of a crime novella tucked inside it, and I'll explain that in a bit. So if you're not familiar with it, it's quite difficult to explain, but I'm going to attempt to do it. The book came out in 2004, which actually, it's strange to think it's 20 years ago, almost 20 years ago, because it's quite, in some ways, it's a very modern seeming novel, but it's also quite timeless because it takes place across 6 different time settings and place settings, right? It's a novel which is incredibly bold and ambitious in its approach, and kind of unlike any other novel I've read. It was shortlisted for the Booker Prize and the Nebula Award and the Arthur C. Clarke Award, and it was kind of lauded as both a literary novel and also as a hugely successful work of speculative fiction. And you might be familiar with the film adaptation of it as well, which was directed by the Wachowski siblings and stars, among others, Tom Hanks, Halle Berry, Jim Sturgis, Hugh Grant, Ben Whishaw, Jim Broadbent, and many others. So when people talk about books as being genre spanning or genre defying, I mean, this is the book, I think, because it contains 6 genres in one book in a completely unique structure. It's often described as sort of 6 nested stories inside each other. So almost like Chinese dolls, where there's one that contains another one that contains another one, contains another one. So basically it's 6 different settings, and you get the first half of all 6. And basically then you get like the 6th story is like intact, and then you get the back half of all 6 in sort of descending order. So it starts in the mid-19th century, and you're reading basically, it seems like it's called the Pacific Journal of Adam Ewing, and it's basically like a 19th century journal of a young man that's kind of sailing around the South Pacific. So you have all these themes of adventure and slavery. It's kind of almost a mixture of like, Moby Dick and, Kidnapped or Treasure Island. So these kinds of stories are sort of being evoked in that. And then it just like stops in the middle, right? So you're just as you're sort of getting like the hint of what's happening in this story, suddenly it just stops. And then it jumps to the next one. And that takes place in 1931 Belgium. It's the letters of a young Englishman who's writing to his lover. Rufus Sixsmith is his lover. Robert Frobisher is a young gentleman who's a composer, and he's going to work for a reclusive, much older, very famous composer in this kind of drafty house in Belgium. But everything is not quite as it appears in that house. So again, that part of the story really kind of evokes the Gothic in some ways. And when he's in this drafty old house, he stumbles upon the Journal of Adam Ewing, which was written in the century earlier. So that's the connection between those stories. And then it just sort of stops again, and it jumps ahead to the 3rd section, which is the crime kind of noirish novel. And that's the story of Louisa Ray in 1970s California. And so she's a young journalist trying to uncover a possible scandal about a nuclear power plant. But then she also comes across the letters that were written in 1931 Belgium, which made up part 2. And then it turns out there's also a deadly assassin on her tail. So at a very climactic point in that story, it suddenly stops and then it jumps to number 4, which is set in, I guess, sort of 2004 England. And that's incredibly funny. So whereas the previous section was kind of a pulpy, like noirish novel, this is like actually really funny satire about a book publisher who somehow finds himself trapped in a menacing nursing home. So kind of like, and he basically tries to escape, kind of with banding together with a number of other pensioners who are trying to escape this menacing nursing home. And then the 5th, and for me, the 5th and the 6th are kind of the most unique, because the 5th section is science fiction that takes place centuries from now in a futuristic Korea, told from the viewpoint of a female cyborg living in a society where most of the labor is performed by cyborgs who are themselves denied a soul and the ability to determine their own fate. So there's a dark kind of secret that underlies that society and the way it runs. And then just when that's reaching a pretty exciting point, then suddenly we get the 6th and the final story called Solutions Crossing, which is my favorite. And that's almost told as a folktale set in a post-apocalyptic society in Hawaii. But there's vestiges of a much more advanced civilization that had come before, obviously the one that was in number 5. And that's kind of told in a patois language you kind of have to figure out as you're reading. And so 6 is kind of the only intact story. And then when that finishes, you get the second half of part 5, then the second half of part 4, 3, 2, 1. So you do, in the end, get all of the different stories. And I don't want to give too much away, but sometimes you're, as a reader, always thinking, okay, how do these things connect to each other? There's definitely a thematic link in that they're in some ways all about the abuse of power between tribes, between nations, between people, and having to challenge that oppressor, kind of the triumph of the human spirit in the face of all of that. But they're also, what's really, for me, most impressive of it as a piece of literature is that they're all incredibly different, right? Incredibly different settings, but also written in very different styles. But David Mitchell nails every single style. So the funny bits are incredibly funny. The science fiction is all inspiring and horrifying at the same time. And then the number 6, the kind of post-apocalyptic story I found to be incredibly moving. So he's really kind of pushing the boundaries of what novels are capable of. And for me as an author, that's something that, although I'd love to aspire to something like that, I don't know if I'd be capable of writing it, but as a reader, it was something that I found to be completely rewarding, beguiling, and awe-inspiring at the same time. So highly recommend Cloud Atlas.
Thanks so much, Winnie. I completely agree that nobody does genre jumping like David Mitchell. All of his books are that way, and Cloud Atlas is the prime example. So thank you so much for bringing that to our audience. Those of you who have watched previous episodes of We Know Are What We Read know that I always try to make it diverse, and I always try to make sure that we have a fan in the mix, because what would we all be if we didn't have fans reading these books? And in fact, we're all fans, even though we're writers, we're fans of the books that we're celebrating. So this time we have Linda Moore as our fan. Linda Moore has been a voracious reader since her eyes first opened and focused. She works as a library assistant in a small school community library in Scotland, where she has lived for 30 plus years. Linda has attended the Harrogate Crime Festival and Butte Noir, and counts herself lucky to have had the opportunity to chat with the likes of William McAvaney and Ian Rankin. And Linda, we're so happy to have you here.
Hello, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I'm so proud. Right. This is where I should hold my book up. But hey, library assistant, I can't find it. So we'll just carry on without it. The book I've chosen is the reason why I'm not a writer. Well, one of many reasons, obviously. When I read an average crime book, I think, hell, I could do that if I put a bit of effort into it. And then I remember On Beulah Height by Reginald Hill, and I know I could never come close to writing anything quite as perfect as that. So the sheer power and control of his storytelling, it's just awesome. I have no words. That's why I'm not a writer. This is why I'm a library assistant, not a Z-list author with 3 fans. So I should probably be grateful, really. Right. I first read On Beulah Height. It's a Diane Pascoe book. You might be familiar with the TV series, when it was published in 1998. The author never disappoints, and he certainly didn't this time. So, the book. It opens with a quote. Note. Then I saw there was a way to hell, even from the gates of heaven. John Bunyan, The Pilgrim's Progress. It kind of goes from there. 15 years before the start of the novel, Vendale Valley was flooded to create a reservoir. At the same time, 3 little girls disappeared. In spite of police investigation, which Andy Dial was involved in, their whereabouts remained a mystery, though everyone had their own theories. To present day, the reservoir water starts to drop and another little girl vanishes from a nearby village. So far, so tragic. But are things what they seem? As this is Reginald Hill, of course they aren't. This tale has so many layers, I'd tie myself in knots if I tried to describe them. It's both literal and literary, which could spiral out of control at any point, but somehow he keeps it together. I don't know how. It's all acted out to the soundtrack of Mahler's song cycle, Kinder Totenlieder. You don't have to listen to it, but it does add another layer. There are so many subplots that the sheer amount of information is almost overwhelming. But in the hands of a master storyteller, the reader rides the roller coaster with the characters and eventually is allowed to stagger off with head spinning and wobbly legs. At the start of COVID lockdown, I decided to listen to the audio version again. It was a difficult time for all of us, I suppose. My daughter had died a couple of months before, and I wasn't in a good place. As I listened, I wondered what the hell I was doing, putting myself through this story of lost, missing, and dying girls. And yet, as the story unfolded, I was able to immerse myself in the world of Mid Yorkshire and the lives and deaths of the characters. That's why I knew this was a very special book. If you've not read Reginald Hill's work, you're in for a treat. As well as the Diane Pascoe books, there's the Joe Sixsmith series. That's Private Detective in Luton. Yeah, it doesn't sound likely, but it really works. And he's done loads of standalones as well under various pen names and his own name, and they're all worth the read. So, that is my book.
Well, I'm going to read this one too. This one, getting hooked up with Kristopher was the worst thing for my pocketbook. I'm just always buying books and reading books, but thank you so much for bringing that one to us. And anyone that knows me knows that librarians and teachers, I think, are the most important people in the world. So thank you so much for everything that you do. And thanks for being with us today. Our next and final guest today is Ayo Onatade. Ayo is, and it's a person that I've been hearing about for so many years, and I'm just so glad I get to actually meet in person via Zoom. You know what I mean? She is a CWA Red Herring Award-winning freelance commentator, panel moderator, and all things crime fiction related. She is currently a judge for the Ian Fleming Steel Dagger and Nio Marsh Awards. Her taste in crime fiction runs the gamut from historical crime fiction to hard-boiled and short stories and crime fiction literary criticism. She covers it all. So we're so glad that you're here. Thank you so much for coming. Take it away.
Thank you so much for having me, both of you, both Chris and Shawn. The book I've chosen is A Rage in Harlem, which is the first in the Harlem Cycle series by Chester Himes. It introduces 2 iconic characters who are detectives, Coffin Ed Johnson and Gravedigger Jones. My introduction to Chester Himes goes back to what I like to refer to as my initial noir days, the period where I had finished reading Golden Age classics and moved on to such authors as Chandler, Hammett, Kane, and Thompson. The story about In Rage in Harlem is about a woman who persuades her unsuspecting boyfriend that she's apparently found a foolproof way of making money, turning $10 bills into $100 bills. Needless to say, the scheme fails, and the conned man desperately needs to get the money back, and he borrowed it from his boss. In desperation, he approaches his brother, who is a snitch for the two detectives, hence their involvement. And the two police partners try to track down the conned man, the swindlers, so that the conned man can get his money back. Whilst the two detectives are not as prominent in A Rage in Harlem as they soon will be in the other books, it is certainly a good introduction to the two of the toughest and, if somewhat, underhand detectives one has the enjoyment of reading about. The one thing that both detectives try to do is to bring order to the scene, usually using methods that are just as illegal and as deadly as that of criminals. Himes' characters show the hard, cynical wit of the urban poor who know how to cheat and lie to the white world to survive physically, and cheat and lie to themselves to survive psychologically. Whilst Himes has been regarded as the toughest of Black detective writers, he is sadly, in my opinion, not being given the same accolades that the likes of Hammett, Chandler, Kane, and Thompson have. By today's standards, it is likely that there would be a lot of complaints about this hard-boiled story because of their time, the Coffin and Digger Jones are excessively violent. This book is not for the prudish, and modern readers might find that it makes for uncomfortable reading. However, do not let that put you off reading A Rage in Harlem. The reason I have chosen A Rage in Harlem is because Chester Himes is often overlooked, and he is just as important in my eyes as Chandler, Hammett, Kane, and Thompson. Himes' stories take the reader through the criminal underbelly of New York, warts and all. The further reason I chose this book is the fact that Himes was quite upfront in the way in which he portrayed the treatment of the Black underclass. It is an urban police procedural like no other. And despite the high degree of violence, I think that A Rage in Harlem should be a lot better known. If you are interested in knowing more about Black crime writers, then start with Chester Himes and A Rage in Harlem, and you won't regret it. You can then go on to read such authors as Walter Mosley, who was basically the next biggest Black crime writer. But for me, Chester Himes is the one to start with, and that's my reason for suggesting A Rage in Harlem by Chester Himes. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Ayo. I agree. Chester Himes is wonderful. You can't go wrong with his stuff, and it is a bearer to what we were watching now happening in crime writing of color. So that's great. As everyone knows, we like to end the episode with looking forward, since we've been spending the whole time looking back. So Shawn and I always highlight a book that's coming out soon that we'd like to highlight, and we're doing UK books because we're doing a UK episode. So my choice for that is Val McDermid's Past Lying. Everybody knows Val McDermid's a legend in crime fiction. This is the 7th book in her Karen Pirie series. For those that don't know, that series has been adapted to ITV and BritBox, so you can watch the earlier episodes before you read the new novel. This entry, set in Edinburgh in 2020 in the early days of the pandemic. The city's on lockdown, and Karen finds herself investigating a cold case involving a crime novelist who's in career competition with each other, and one of them is now dead. She must untangle the truth and the fiction to find out what is behind this long-standing rivalry, and I cannot wait to read it. Shawn, what did you pick?
I can't wait to read that one too, Val. But I chose something a little bit on the lighter side this time because I've been tending towards dark recently. But I got the arc recently of Nosy Neighbors by Freya Sampson, and it looks so fun. It's a cozy mystery. It's about two neighbors. One of them is 25 and one of them is 77, and they're at war with each other in the building until they begin to band together to be at war with someone else in their building and to stop a crime. So it just looks really fun. And I'm just reading the description and I think, oh, maybe I'm pretty obsessed with Only Murders in the Building. So it kind of gives me that kind of vibe. And not that I'm not sure if it's going to be like that, but I love that whole dynamic of intergenerational people banding together to solve crimes and maybe have a podcast. But yeah, that's why I'm looking forward to it. It looks fun. It's a fun cover, and I can't wait to dive in. It comes out in April.
That one sounds great, Shawn. Thanks. And thanks everybody for watching. I hope that you'll join us again for future episodes of We Are What We Read. And until then, read widely and read often.